Hi class, this week's subject is social justice. So we will be calling into question what makes a government legitimate, what makes a government just, on what basis do people band together and form nations and so on. And one question that will rise up immediately, especially for us in the US where we have a democratic republic, where we through a popular vote elect representatives who then represent us through a popular vote within a chamber like the Senate. We will ask the question whether democracy is the best form of government. And it might be a question that you've never asked yourself, because growing up in a democracy, we tend to take it for granted, and we've always been told that it is the best form of government. But philosophers will want to call everything into question. And if we do believe that democracy is the best form of government, we're going to need an argument supporting that view. And we will have some contenders, one of which is Plato. Plato thought democracy was a terrible form of government, and he had reason to believe this. Number one, Athens fought a losing war to an authoritarian Sparta. And that has a lot to do with democracy being incredibly inefficient. While Sparta, with their authoritarian regime, was able to quickly and decisively implement wartime strategies, Athens had to call different strategies into question and vote on them. And it ended up being very inefficient and a losing strategy. And further, Plato saw his beloved teacher Socrates put to death via a majority rule vote. We'll also look at Thomas Hobbes, the founder of social contract theory, who was also a supporter of a monarchy and a harsh critic of democracy. So we'll look at their reasons, but there's also really very good reasons to think that democracy is the best, or at least a good form of government, or a just form of government. So we will be calling into question the legitimacy of the United States, which is essentially a project in social justice. Just to make the point clear that it's not a bad thing to call your own state or country into question. I want to read from an American philosopher, Richard Rorty, just to show that being critical of your country is not a sign of not being patriotic, for instance. So I will post this on Canvas too, but I think it's a powerful quote from a lecture he gave called Achieving Our Country. National pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary condition for self-improvement. Too much national pride can produce bellicosity and imperialism, just as excessive self-respect can produce arrogance. But just as too little self-respect makes it difficult for a person to display moral courage, so insufficient national pride makes energetic and effective debate about national policy unlikely. Emotional involvement with one's country, feelings of intense shame, or of glowing pride aroused by various parts of its history and by various present-day national policies is necessary if political deliberation is to be imaginative and productive. Such deliberation will probably not occur unless pride outweighs shame. So there is a place for some degree of shame in our country's history and in our country as it presently is. But in order for one to engage in a productive way, according to Rorty, the pride in one's country needs to outweigh that shame. But this will involve questions of what social justice is, so we can identify the social injustices that have occurred and are occurring in our country, but also recognize the legitimacy of the U.S. social justice project. Okay, so of course, democracy relies on majority rule. And problems immediately arise from a majority rule system. Notably, what if the majority are wrong in their opinion? For instance, what if you could think about some social issues today that might need a very directed, unified response, and we just can't get there because of majority rule. For instance, suppose climate change is real, suppose it's actually caused by human activities, suppose that there is a path towards curbing climate change, but we simply can't get enough people on board with it. And we actually drive ourselves into a more and more precarious future because we simply can't get the majority rule on this issue. Then that would be a problem for democracy, a shortcoming of democracy, a time when democracy fails us. Suppose there's a humanitarian crisis occurring in the world, and we simply, and social justice requires immediate and effective action on our part, and we simply don't have the votes to approve it. Then once again, democracy fails us in having us not meeting the requirements of social justice. Okay, political philosophies can be justified in a number of ways. One way is a means to an end. So if the consequences are preferable, then a system of government is justified when it creates the best consequences. Democracy typically fails in this arena. It doesn't mean it always fails. Sometimes we democratically approve of what needs to happen that actually causes flourishing and increased well-being in a society. But this is one of the main objections against democracy, is that at times, because we lack the majority ruling on something, we end up hurting ourselves in the future and causing worse consequences for ourselves. So democracy is typically not justified as a government that creates a good means to an end. It doesn't necessarily create better consequences for the majority. Okay, that's the point. Where democracy is typically justified is via a rights-based argument. This is non-consequentialist. And next week, when we talk about ethics, we'll be getting really into detail on this consequentialist versus non-consequentialist way of thinking. But democracy is typically supported because people think that every citizen in a country has an inherent right to liberty. And liberty requires that you have a way of influencing your government. You exercise your liberty, your freedom, when you vote, because you are influencing, you're taking your part and personally influencing the direction of your government. And so regardless of the consequences of that vote, the vote is justified because it is the only way to ensure that your rights are upheld. So democracy is not justified as a means to an end. The consequences are less important than preserving the individual rights. So even if we could, curb climate change, and it would be better for us if we did, proponents of democracy will accept a vote against taking the steps necessary to address climate change, because accepting that vote means accepting that everybody has a right to liberty, and everyone has a right to have a say on this issue, and we ought to accept the say of the majority.